Brothers and sisters, history does not always announce itself with trumpets. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the ink of a signature, in the resolve of a young leader standing before the world. When Ibrahim Traoré sat across from India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi, a contract worth $15 billion was signed. Yet what mattered was not the sum written on the page, but the chains it promised to shatter. For generations, Africa was told that our place was to receive aid dressed as generosity, but poisoned as dependency. We were told to bow, to borrow, to beg, but this agreement marks something different. A nation once dismissed as small, landlocked, and fragile, stepping into the arena of equals. Oil for technology, energy for factories, sovereignty for respect. The question before us is greater than numbers. It is this. Will this pact be remembered as the dawn of Africa's long-awaited independence, or will it join the graveyard of broken promises? Stay with us. This is not just a headline. It is a turning point. Subscribe and share so together we guard the dream of a continent that will never kneel again. The day the cameras flashed in Ouagadougou, the air carried more than the sound of journalists clicking pens. It carried the weight of generations who had tilled dry soil, bent under colonial chains, and prayed for a dawn they might never see. When the figure 15 billion echoed through the hall, some saw only numbers, but for the people of Burkina Faso, it was the sound of possibility cracking through the silence of neglect. For decades, our nation was treated as an afterthought. A small, landlocked country ranked among the poorest, often dismissed in the corridors of global power. Politicians in Paris, Washington, and Brussels spoke of us only in terms of aid packages and stability missions. But on that day, seated across from Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Captain Ibrahim Traoré held a pen that wrote a different chapter. It was not the language of dependency, but of partnership. Not the vocabulary of debt, but of dignity. The contract was laid out with precision. $4 billion directed into oil extraction and refining, ensuring that Burkina Faso would not remain forever a mere exporter of crude, but would climb the ladder of value-added production. No longer would barrels leave our soil only to return as costly petrol. We would build the capacity to refine, to profit, and to power our own industries. $5 billion into petrochemicals and energy infrastructure, pipelines stretching across our land, storage facilities rising, processing plants humming with new life. This was not charity, it was construction. It promised not only energy for India's growing demand, but also for our schools, our factories, and our villages long left in darkness. $3 billion for steel and manufacturing. Imagine the sight. Furnaces blazing in the heart of Burkina Faso, steel rails forged by our own workers, machinery assembled by our own youth, factories shaping the rails, bridges, and engines of tomorrow. For a nation once told it had no role but to export raw ore, this was a statement. We will no longer be the suppliers of dust, but the builders of destiny. $2 billion for defense production. A recognition that sovereignty without security is fragile. Rifles and armored vehicles not imported at inflated prices from distant powers, but assembled in our own soil by Burkinabe hands trained with Indian expertise. A quiet revolution for what dignity exists in begging others to protect us. And $1 billion for agriculture, telecommunications, and training programs. Because what is industry without educated minds? What is sovereignty without fertile fields? In classrooms where students still study by candlelight, new technologies would arrive. In fields long watered by sweat alone, modern equipment could change harvests. These were not loans with hidden chains. They were foreign direct investments, placing India's capital directly into our soil, expecting growth on both sides. India sought secure energy. Burkina Faso sought transformation. It was, at least on paper, a bargain of equals. But beyond the figures lay a deeper symbolism. For years, the West positioned itself as the sole gatekeeper to Africa's future. Aid was given not out of love, but as a leash. Loans came with conditions that stripped dignity rather than strengthened it. The world was told that African nations were too divided, too weak, too corrupt to rise. Yet in that moment, as signatures were inked, a message traveled far beyond Ouagadougou. Africa was not begging, it was bargaining. To the farmer in Kaya, to the market woman in Bobo Dioulasso, to the student in Koudougou, this deal was more than words in a conference hall. It was a chance, just a chance, that the promises would at last reach their lives, that light bulbs would flicker in their homes, that steady jobs would keep their children from fleeing abroad, that factories would offer not slogans but pay slips. Still, even as the cameras captured smiles and handshakes, skepticism lingered in the streets. Too many times had deals been signed and celebrated, only to vanish into corruption, bureaucracy, and foreign bank accounts. The people knew the truth. The ink of contracts means little if it does not dry into reality. This was the paradox of that historic day. In one sense, Burkina Faso stepped onto the world stage as never before. In another, it stood at the edge of a dangerous cliff. Success could mark the rebirth of a nation, and failure could bury yet another dream. And so the question still hangs heavy in the air. Was this agreement the key that unlocks a future long denied, or was it simply another gilded promise that history will one day call betrayal? The cameras captured the signing, yes, but what they could not capture was the storm already gathering behind the celebration. The hall erupted with applause as the signatures dried, but beneath the clapping hands and smiling faces, a tremor could be felt. It was the kind of tremor that does not shake buildings but unsettles empires. When Captain Ibrahim Traoré lifted his eyes after signing the pact, it was not simply the gesture of a young leader, it was the echo of centuries refusing to kneel. For the first time in generations, a Burkinabe leader stood before the world not as a supplicant, but as a negotiator, not with a begging bowl, but with a contract. That was the moment he declared, without words, that dependency was no longer the script by which Africa would live. And that declaration, more than the 15 billion itself, became the story whispered across the globe. In Ouagadougou, the reaction was immediate and complex. Crowds gathered in markets, their radios crackling with reports of the deal. Taxi drivers shook their heads in wonder, some skeptical, others hopeful. Farmers paused in their fields, asking if the billions promised would ever reach their villages. Students, weary from studying in dimly lit classrooms, debated fiercely. Was this pact the dawn of opportunity or just another illusion? A woman selling millet in the city center put it plainly. If this brings light to my home, then it is real. If not, it is just another speech. Her words captured the fragile balance between faith and doubt. Meanwhile, beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the reactions grew sharper. In Washington, policymakers murmured about shifting alliances. In Paris, where influence over its former colonies is guarded like a crown jewel, officials watched with unease. In Brussels, diplomats feared what a chain reaction of sovereignty might mean for Europe's access to African resources. And in Beijing, a quiet calculation was made. Would India's advance disrupt China's long game on the continent? The global press spun the story in countless ways. Some headlines praised the deal as a bold leap for Africa's youngest leader. Others framed it as reckless, warning that India was exploiting desperation. Yet behind the ink and microphones, one truth was undeniable. The world had been forced to look at Burkina Faso, a nation once dismissed, now writing its own chapter. The symbolism was electric. For decades, the West had insisted Africa was too small to matter, too divided to rise. They sent aid with strings, lectures with loans, weapons with conditions. Now, in that room of flashing cameras, the old powers glimpsed something they had long feared, an Africa that bargains rather than begs. In the villages, that symbolism translated into hope. Young men imagined steady jobs in steel factories. Women dreamed of affordable electricity. Elders spoke of a day when Africa would no longer be mocked as helpless. Yet side by side with hope came suspicion. The people remembered past betrayals too clearly. Deals that promised progress but delivered only disappointment. Leaders who pledged dignity but filled their own pockets instead. The emotion of the moment, then, was a mixture as potent as fire and water, pride, hope, suspicion, and fear. Pride that a Burkinabe leader dared to sign a contract of equals with a global power. Hope that the billions might transform lives. Suspicion that corruption might devour the gains. Fear that the West, rattled and offended, would not let such a shift go unchallenged. The whispers grew louder in corridors of global power. What is Traore doing? How dare Burkina Faso defy the script? Some said he was reckless, others that he was visionary. But whether praised or condemned, the fact remained. A nation once ignored had seized the headlines of the world. And perhaps the most striking reaction of all was not from politicians or newspapers, but from ordinary Africans across the continent. In Bamako, Dakar, Accra, Lagos, conversations buzzed. If Burkina Faso can do this, why not us? A spark had been lit, and sparks, once set free, can ignite fires no empire can contain. The signing was the climax, yes. But every climax carries a shadow. The applause faded, the cameras were packed away, the journalists flew home. What remained was a nation standing at the edge of expectation, with millions of eyes watching not just from within, but from across Africa and the world. The signatures may have shaken the old order, but the greater question loomed: would the tremor grow into an earthquake, or would it be smothered before it could change the world? In the weeks following the signing, the conversation shifted from applause to anticipation. Markets buzzed with speculation. Families debated around dinner tables, and elders in village squares asked the question that weighed on every heart. What will this deal mean for our daily lives? The short-term impact seemed promising. Infrastructure projects promised thousands of jobs. Construction sites for refineries, pipelines, and factories would require welders, engineers, drivers, cooks, and laborers. Young men and women who once dreamed of leaving for Europe or the Gulf now began to hope for work within their own borders. "If I can earn here," one student said, "why should I risk my life in the desert?" Electricity, long a scarce luxury, stood at the center of these hopes. The $5 billion earmarked for petrochemicals and energy infrastructure was not just about fueling India's industries. It was about lighting Burkinabe homes. Villages that had never known steady power dreamed of classrooms with computers, hospitals with refrigeration, and homes without the constant hum of generators. The thought alone was enough to ignite cautious optimism. In the medium term, the $3 billion investment in steel and manufacturing carried even greater significance. For too long, Burkina Faso had been a supplier of raw resources, exporting its wealth only to buy back finished goods at inflated prices. The promise of local factories suggested a reversal of that humiliating pattern. For once, rails, bridges, and machines might bear the mark "Made in Burkina Faso." And then there was defense. $2 billion dedicated to producing rifles, vehicles, and communication systems locally. It was not a solution to terrorism in itself, but it was a shift in posture. Instead of renting protection from abroad, the nation would begin building its own shield. The psychological impact was immense. Burkina Faso no longer wished to appear as a child clinging to foreign guardians, but as a sovereign state capable of defending its own. Yet with every opportunity came a shadow. People knew too well the dangers that lurked in deals of this magnitude. Corruption has been the thief of African dreams for generations. Funds mismanaged, contracts siphoned, factories turned into monuments of waste. Could this time be different? Would oversight be strong enough? Institutions disciplined enough to resist the old demons? Technology transfer was another concern. Would Indian firms truly train Burkinabe youth, or would they keep the highest skills to themselves while locals remain cheap labor? Would factories become enclaves of foreign control, fenced off from the very people they were meant to serve? There was also the risk of profits vanishing abroad. Even if the projects succeeded, who would benefit? If dividends flowed only to foreign investors, if ownership remained external, then ordinary citizens might still find themselves spectators in their own supposed victory. This tension between opportunity and betrayal was palpable in every corner of the country. In Ouagadougou's markets, women whispered, "Will this pact change the price of onions?" In Kaya's farmlands, men asked, Will tractors reach us, or will they stop in the cities? In Bobo Dioulasso, students wondered if training centers would truly equip them, or merely serve as symbols for speeches. The political order was equally at stake. If the pact delivered real jobs and power, Traore's legitimacy would soar, not just at home but across the continent. But if it faltered, if corruption spread or promises dissolved, the backlash could be swift and unforgiving. A failed pact would not only weaken a government but could destabilize a nation, fueling unrest and giving strength to those who whisper that Africa cannot govern itself. That is why this moment is more than economics. It is a test of national discipline, of whether Burkina Faso can walk the narrow path between hope and despair. The pact is not a miracle. It is a chance, and chances once wasted seldom return. Invitation to viewers. If you believe this is the dawn of anti-colonial Africa, type Amen in the comments. Let your voice be heard. Because the truth is clear. The greatest battlefield will not be in conference halls, but in the streets of Ouagadougou, in the fields of Kaya, in the factories of Bobo Dioulasso. That is where the pact will succeed or die. The billions have been promised, but the question remains, will they build a new nation, or will they build only new disappointments? Beyond Burkina Faso's borders, the signing of the $15 billion pact rippled like a shockwave. In Washington, the deal was read not as an economic transaction, but as a geopolitical warning. American analysts noted with unease that a young African leader had bypassed Western institutions, refusing loans tied to conditions and instead securing direct investment from Asia. For decades, the United States relied on the image of Africa as dependent. The image of Ouagadougou signing as an equal rattled that narrative. In Paris, the tremor struck deeper. Burkina Faso, once counted among France's closest spheres of influence, had chosen to align with a partner outside the Francophone orbit. For French policymakers, this was not simply economics. It was erosion of prestige, a loss of control over a region long treated as a backyard. Newspapers in Paris warned that a dangerous precedent had been set. Dangerous not because of the money itself, but because the contract showed that African nations could walk away from their colonial legacy and chart their own course. Brussels, too, watched nervously. The European Union has depended on African resources to sustain industries, often under trade terms tilted in Europe's favor. If Burkina Faso could insist on partnerships that emphasized mutual benefit, then what would prevent Ghana, Mali, or Senegal from following the same path? For Europe, the fear was clear. Sovereignty might spread like wildfire. Within Africa, reactions were mixed. ECOWAS and the African Union struggled to speak in one voice. Some governments praised Traore's boldness, seeing in him the possibility of a new regional order. Others, wary of provoking Western powers, urged caution. For nations tied tightly to aid or the CFA franc, the example of Burkina Faso was both inspiring and unsettling. Could they afford to take the same risk? Elsewhere, Moscow and Beijing observed carefully. Russia, seeking influence in Africa, saw opportunity in a continent less tied to Western structures. China, after years of investing billions in African infrastructure, measured India's move as competition. For both, the shift in Ouagadougou signaled a continent less predictable, less easy to control. And India, what of its role? For New Delhi, the pact was not merely about oil. It was about securing energy for a booming population, countering China's dominance, and building long-term partnerships that stretched across continents. The symbolism mattered. India presenting itself as a partner that trades rather than dictates, invests rather than lectures. For Traore, this alignment promised tools of sovereignty. For Modi, it offered resources and influence. Yet across the globe, in chancelleries and think tanks, the same unease surfaced. If Burkina Faso succeeded, others would follow. If it failed, it would be wielded as proof that Africa must remain under the guardianship of the old order. The world has taken its positions, but one question lingers. Will this pact become the blueprint for a new global balance, or the cautionary tale that powers use to keep Africa in chains? Every great gamble carries two paths, one bright, one dark. The pact signed in Ouagadougou is no exception. Its promise is vast, yet its risks are equally heavy. In the best of futures, factories rise from the Burkinabe soil, their furnaces glowing with steel that will shape bridges and railways. Oil revenues are refined at home, powering industries and homes alike. Young engineers trained under Indian programs design software, machines, and technologies that tie Africa not to dependency, but to innovation. Electricity flows steadily into villages where children once studied by candlelight. Farmers harvest with modern tools, their yields feeding not only local families but also regional markets. Defense industries equip Burkinabe soldiers with rifles and vehicles produced in their own land, a symbol of sovereignty finally secured. In this future, Burkina Faso becomes not a forgotten periphery but a bridge between Africa and Asia, a hub of African development. But the darker road lies close beside it. Corruption could seep in, as it has so often, draining funds into private pockets. Factories might be built but controlled entirely by foreign hands, leaving locals as mere laborers while profits fly overseas. Promises of technology transfer could remain slogans, never reaching the youth they were meant to train. If transparency fails, if leadership falters, then the pact could collapse into another broken promise, another scar on the long struggle of Africa's dignity. Which path will prevail depends not on destiny but on discipline. Leadership must remain firm, institutions vigilant, and citizens watchful. For in the end, sovereignty is not protected by signatures alone, but by the will of the people to defend it against corruption and foreign manipulation. And this is larger than Burkina Faso. Across Africa, from Dakar to Accra, from Bamako to Nairobi, eyes are fixed on Ouagadougou. If Traore succeeds, a fire of sovereignty may sweep across the continent. Leaders will dare to demand fair partnerships, and people will believe that the dream of anti-colonial Africa can at last be lived. If he fails, skeptics will laugh, declaring Africa incapable of self-rule, reinforcing chains that history has tried to break for too long. To the elders who marched for independence decades ago, this moment is not abstract. It is the continuation of their unfinished struggle. To the youth, it is the chance to build a future where migration is a choice, not a necessity. To the continent, it is a turning point that may not come again. And so the road forks before us, one leading to a continent reborn, the other to dreams betrayed. Which will Africa choose? Brothers and sisters, history does not move in straight lines. It bends, it falters, it tests the patience of those who carry the heaviest burdens. For too long, Africa's story was written in the languages of others. Paris, Washington, London. For too long, our labor was taken, our resources drained, our hopes mortgaged for debts that never ended. That is why this moment matters. Because in the signing of that pact, however fragile, however uncertain, we saw a different vision take shape. It is not perfection nor a miracle. It is a chance. A chance for jobs that hold our youth at home, for electricity that lights our villages, for factories that carry our name, for weapons built not for conquest but for dignity. It is a chance for Africa to choose its partners rather than be chosen by others. This is the heartbeat of anti-colonial Africa, not simply resisting the past but building a new future with our own hands. It is not enough to reject the chains. We must forge tools that shape tomorrow. And if we succeed, this pact will not be remembered as an isolated contract, but as the first stone in the foundation of a freer continent. But if we fail, if corruption returns, if promises fade, then it will be more than Burkina Faso that suffers. It will be Africa itself, mocked once more as incapable of governing, trapped once more in the narrative of dependency. That is why this moment is sacred. Because the struggle is no longer only about freedom from colonialism, but about proving that we can create lasting African development that honors our ancestors and sustains our children. The question now belongs to us. Will we guard this chance with vigilance, or will we let it slip as so many before? If this story touched your spirit, do not stay silent. Like, share, and subscribe. Our history was silenced for too long. Let us speak our future aloud. Type your belief in the comments. New Africa. Africa rise. Africa can do it. Let the world know that the time of anti-colonial Africa is not a dream. It is a movement.